Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Journey Podcast. I'm Morgan DeBaun, your host. Today, we are getting into a topic that I actually don't talk about that much because I always have so much going on. But I have a nonprofit with my co founders called Blavity.org. And recently, I shared a point of view on social that said, Black folk, I need y'all to stop making so many nonprofits. And everybody either agreed or didn't agree with me, but very strong opinions either way. And I wanted to actually talk about my journey with my own nonprofit and also bring our internal expert and consultant who works with the Blavity.org nonprofit, Dr. Sharon, here to join me today to talk about different ways you could think about approaching the nonprofit space and really impact in your business or impact in your life, regardless of kind of where you are in your life, what you're thinking about. We wanted to just talk about how you could approach that for yourself. So Dr. Sharon is incredible. She runs a organization called the Nonprofit Plug, and she has both a nonprofit and a for-profit business, really a foundation. And we'll talk about the difference between all of those things. But she has a foundation and a for-profit business where she helps companies, nonprofits like mine. She has over $15 million that has been raised by the companies that she works with and nonprofits that she works with, and over $5 million in assets under management, AUM. And so she has a lot of experience, hundreds of clients, and she is also just a joy to work with. I can tell you, me and my co-founders, we are not easy. Like, we all have a lot going on all the time, and it is definitely like herding literal bees. And she is incredibly patient and kind, and it's just a joy to work with her. So Dr. Sharon, welcome to the show today.
Thank you so much. That was an excellent intro. I love it.
She's like, yeah, y'all crazy. Hey everyone, I'm Morgan DeBaun, a passionate entrepreneur and life advisor. With the Journey podcast, you'll discover that success isn't about the destination, it's about the journey. I'm sharing stories of amazing people who've taken control of their lives. Join me on my own journey to discover the secret sauce behind reaching success with permission from no one else. Okay, so first, let me just tell you how we started a nonprofit, and then we could talk a little bit about, I don't even know if you know this story, but like we could talk about how we got here and then some of the things that I maybe would have done a little bit differently.
Yeah, I love it.
So Blavity started in 2014, over 10 years ago. And when I started the business, I wanted to help people. I also wanted to make money. And I knew from the beginning that I wanted it to be an enterprise because I believed that it would be possible for a business to both make money and help people at the same time. As the business got bigger, I started to raise funding from social impact investors. And I had never heard of social impact investors before. I just thought you were just a VC and you focused on returning value back to your LPs or your shareholders, or the people who invested in you. And that was the priority. And as I was exploring the different types of investors who were going to invest in me, mostly because a lot of people said no. And I said, well, somebody somewhere has got to say yes. I stumbled across these people who were social impact investors. That's how they define themselves. And in those processes of pitching those investors, they would start to ask me questions like, well, how are you going to measure your impact? And I'm like, what do you mean? I mean, just existing to me is impact. Like, if Black media at its core is a function that is giving access to information to people who otherwise are not going to get spoken to in the way that they understand or appreciate, and or information from their perspective on how current events impact them. And it was, to me, it was obvious what the social impact was. So when they kept pushing me, I'm like, well, how are you going to measure it? I kind of was like, I literally was like, I don't understand your question, because obviously there's a social impact here. Now, many years later, I understand why they needed to measure it, because they had investors behind them that were basically trying to say, okay, well, how many jobs are you creating? How much money are you putting back into the ecosystem because this exists? How many voters are you registering? Right. So I started to get smart about like, oh, you're like asking me, are we going to do the right thing? And then how do you know that you did the right thing? Yeah, sure. I could come up with all these KPIs that do that. I'm like, of course, of course, we can talk about the small businesses that we promote on our editorial and how many people are becoming speakers because we're the first company to ever give them a speaking engagement. Or we can talk about the income that we spend by hiring Black producers and Black creators for all of our campaigns and the money that goes into Black creators' pockets from us. Like, we can talk about with Afrotech, all the vendors that we prioritize minority and Black owned vendors. Because to me, I'm like, duh, I'm going to operate this way. I just never thought that it was something that deserved a hand clap or to be measured. And so the
Oh,
more that I
yeah.
interacted with these social impact investors, I realized, oh, like this is a whole industry. Like this is a whole segment of people that operate this way. And I could choose to intentionally be a part of this industry. And that is where I started to bubble up and say, like, oh, wow, there's like decisions that we make as a for enterprise company that hurts my bottom line. Like sometimes going with the Black or woman owned business means I am spending more money than I would if I wasn't otherwise. I used to just give away tickets to Afrotech. Like literally a student would DM me and be like, Morgan, I'm a senior at Spelman. I have a CS major. Immediately, ticket. Like I don't even have to finish reading it. Like your CS major at Spelman, done. Like we would
Mhm.
just give away hundreds and hundreds of tickets. I wasn't getting any credit for that. And as we were getting larger, and larger. And my investors and I wanted to, as a chairperson, I'm like, look, we got to move towards caring about profitability. This was back in 2019 that I said, no more raising money. I'm going to start shooting for profitability. I had just finished our Series A from Google Ventures in 2018. So we had cash in the bank. So I was like, all right, if I'm going to move to profitability, I need to start looking at all the places that we spend just because it's the right thing to do and not necessarily because it's good for the business. The business bottom line. Everything is good for business when you do the right thing. But the bottom line, not so much.
Mhm.
That's when I started the process of we need to move all this activity that we do to the nonprofit. And we didn't have a nonprofit. So I started that with my chief of staff, Ashley Harmon at the time, who started all the paperwork and all the things to get that going. And then, of course, what happened in 2020 with George Floyd's murder, then there was all these new entities who really wanted to invest in Black nonprofits. And by then we had done the 501c3, which in hindsight, I should have got a fiscal sponsor, but I didn't. I went the hard route. So that is my journey. I'll talk more about what we've done since then, but that's kind of like the how and the why we created this and why Blavity Inc. has blavity.org. So, yes, Dr.
Man,
Sharon.
good story. I didn't know that whole piece, and it makes perfect sense why you guys went that route. And I'm glad you went the 501c3 route, because had you gone fiscal sponsorship, and we can go into that, you would have lost a little bit of control and you would have had to rely on other people. And now, you and Jeff and Aaron, you get to make all the decisions, which is a really great, potential and opportunity to that. But cool story. I did not know. That makes perfect sense.
It's definitely a roundabout way, but I think
It's
that
a
it,
reactive way of creating a
yeah,
nonprofit, which is how most nonprofits are created. It's reactive to a problem. You became a
right.
solution.
Exactly. And I think the other thing is I was researching other large tech companies and I was like, why don't these people pay taxes? And I was realizing like so many of them were investing their profits back into the nonprofit of whatever their like giant surplus was. So like Salesforce has like a huge,
Hmm.
huge, huge, huge I mean, it's like crazy when you look at how much money and assets these nonprofits have of these tech companies. So that was the other thing. I was like, something is interesting here when it comes to when you start to become profitable. Where does this money go? What?
Yeah.
How are these people not profitable? Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Sharon, how did you get into this business?
Good question. So I've always been in public service my entire life. My mom was a high school teacher for 30 years. My dad was a forest firefighter. If you know Smokey the Bear, that was my dad. So it was just always ingrained. And the culture I grew up with is the concept of tikkun olam. Tikkun olam means to heal the world. So it was the foundation to our family. So I thought I was going to go the route of, like, my educational background is actually hospital management and hospital leadership. I did that. It was horrible. I was a hospital administrator at the VA health system for a couple of years. Ended up moving into like the partnership division, working with homeless veterans and their outreach services. Got recruited by one of my partners, but right before that happened, I was working with a nonprofit organization while I was still with the VA. So I was a federal employee. So I've had lots of random experience. And we set up this really cool program called Welcome Home, where veterans would get their vouchers for housing from the VA, like
Mhm.
Section 8, it's called HUD VASH. And they would move into these like basically empty, I can't even call it a home. It's like this, just an apartment, a walled building, this empty space with nothing in it. So social workers would go check on their vets. They're not there, of course, because they're out in the street on the corner with their family. There's a couch there. That's comfort. So we were like, oh, that's interesting, and that kind of defeats the purpose of like ending homelessness, right? Which is a functional zero, because there'll never be zero homelessness. So it's functional. And so we partnered with this nonprofit that had excess furniture. They were a thrift store.
Mhm.
And we were able to create this program called Welcome Home. And the furniture would literally get delivered to every single one of these veterans in Southern California, all the way up through Fresno and Central California. And so as I got to know that organization, I ended up getting recruited and went and worked for them. So I left a federal government job. And if for anybody like listening to who knows, like that's like ballsy. That's
Yeah.
leaving a max 40-hour a week job with a killer government salary and full benefits, like all of that.
Yes.
It was more valuable to me as a person to leave that and go work with this nonprofit to do what was really like in my soul and really the concept of my
Mm.
family of Tikkun Olam. And so I did that. I did it for a couple of years. We probably housed in partnership with the VA and local housing authorities over 5,000 vets in just the first couple of
Wow.
years. And it was so cool. They would just fill out a form, say what furniture they needed, and then this nonprofit would deliver it. A
Wow.
bed, like a brand new bed, which we ended up getting a grant from Good 360, and they shipped in $10,000 worth of Tempur-Pedic mattresses. And I say all this to make a point as to like some of the benefits of nonprofit, right? So then the vets would get their bed, they would get a coffee table, they would get kitchen utensils, a $20 grocery gift card, like just all this stuff for the basic necessities. And
Mhm.
every single social worker that went to check on their vet, the veteran was in their home with their family.
Oh,
It
that's
was
like
unbelievable. So built that nonprofit industry. I got laid off a couple years later, and I was like,
stuff.
meh, good opportunity. Finished my doctorate, got my doctorate, couldn't get a job because nobody wanted to hire anyone with a PhD. And so I was on the side hustling, just helping nonprofits connect resources, find grants, find
Mhm.
partnerships, whatever they kind of needed. And so people would call me the plug. And I'm like, oh, that's cool. I like being the plug. Like, I like being a resource for people. My parents are like, are you doing drugs? And I'm like, I'm not that kind of plug, but it is Los Angeles. So they're like, no, 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 you're the nonprofit plug. And so that's really kind of where my company blossomed. It was kind of like a nickname at first. And then I was like, wow, like how can I make money and a salary since nobody will hire me with my doctorate?
Mhm.
I dropped it off my resume, got interviews, got a couple of jobs. They were horrible, quit them like 2 months later. So I was like, I need to be paid to connect people and to be a resource and to provide support to nonprofit business developers. So I started the nonprofit plug, and it's really just it's a part of my blood is what I tell people.
Mhm.
I literally can't help myself. I can't not connect people and resources and try to find opportunities for folks. So I had to create it into a mechanism that also funded, my life and paid that Los Angeles rent.
That's right. And I think that's an incredible journey, and I think it just shows, like, you are uniquely made for that because it also you had experience in the government, you had experience working on partnerships within the nonprofit space with enterprises so that it's mutually beneficial for both groups. You've seen the ups and downs of like when you can't get the funding, the market doesn't necessarily always sustain all the nonprofits. And that I
Mhm.
think that was one of my biggest reasons or points to people when I was like, y'all love nonprofits and it's not always the best thing to do because when your nonprofit is just floating in the wind and it's not tied to an enterprise, in my opinion, you're putting yourself at the whims of donors and philanthropists. And that effort that you could be spending on building a product or some sort of source of income, like for your nonprofit, to me, it's the same amount of effort that you're going to have to spend constantly writing grants. And then the compliance behind, if you get a 10-cent grant, the compliance is still the same. Like the
10 cents,
effort
negative cents, millions of cents. It's all the exact same. Yeah.
and that sunk energy on the compliance, we're going to talk this. That's what drives me nuts about Blavity.org. I'm like, yo, you gave us money 4 years ago. Like, what are you talking about? Like, we did the thing. It's happened. It worked. Move on. They're
Yeah.
like, can you send me? No, no, I cannot send you that.
Yeah.
But that's why I do not run the nonprofit. It's a group of people. But yeah, it's the compliance is what gets me. So, what are the things like? How should someone who's like, I have this idea, I want to help people? How does someone make a decision on if a nonprofit is right for them or not?
So here's the best way I kind of like to think about it, because I do have the experience of both being a nonprofit founder, nonprofit
Hmm.
executive director, and a CEO business owner on the LLC side. So I can speak to both of them. So when someone comes to me and says, I got this idea, I'm thinking about, starting a nonprofit, or I'm not sure which route to go, I ask them, what are you thinking about doing for the community? And that answer to that question will tell me which route they should go. Now,
Hmm.
for example, if I'm talking to someone, and let's say it's someone in education or ed tech's it's a really big one right now. And I'm like, okay, cool. What do you want to do for the community? They're like, well, I want to create a curriculum that I can contract with the school systems and bring to the schools where the kids can do. That feels very for profity to me. Although it's an impact on education, it's educational advocacy, it could be equity in education, it provides alternative options for learning for students, which we love. Here's why I say it's for profit. Not because it sounds for profity, but because it's intellectual property. It
Hmm.
has a component to it that could be proprietary. It has a component to it that you want to own. And the word ownership and own does not exist in the nonprofit world. So, say I was a really bad consultant and I said, start that nonprofit, like F the for profit, start a nonprofit because we just want to avoid the taxes all in all. Just go nonprofit route. And this person created a curriculum or a technology that was like even an app for students that contracted with the school districts. And then they got all these contracts, which some of this is partially true stories,
Hmm.
because I've experienced this with some clients and seen it other places. And I'm like, ooh, no, you should have been a for profit. And they
Hmm.
go and get all these contracts, and their app takes off. And now they're in the US and they're going to go global, and they're nailing contracts, multi-million dollar company. And it's only under the nonprofit, and the nonprofit maintains that intellectual property, and that person gets voted out of their nonprofit. They lose all rights to everything that their brain created. And that's the part, and the only time you'll really ever hear me say create that LLC or keep it under your sole proprietorship until you need to go
Right.
the LLC S corp route. That's the part that kills me. Or people buy property under the nonprofit name and you get voted out of that and you lose all rights. So there's the benefit to having both. And that company is the beneficial for them would be to have the LLC and the nonprofit.
Hmm.
The intellectual property, anything that you create that is proprietary or that you want to own and you want to maintain all decision rights on, that goes under an LLC. So that is how
Right.
I direct the decision making for people who come to me when it's their like initial idea and they haven't filed anything. That's the process I go through. What do you want to do for the community? Let's talk about that. What parts of that may be created that are intellectual property? And then we go from there.
So I think that's really interesting and important. And I just want to highlight this again for people. When you have a nonprofit, you do not own your nonprofit. There is no owner of a nonprofit. So when you're like, I want to create a nonprofit, that's fine. You can create it, but you will not own it.
Mhm.
There's no ownership, there's no shares, there's no stock. You do not own
And the IRS or the state can revoke you just like that, and then you lose
it.
everything.
That's right. And the board is the owner, and that board makeup will fluctuate.
Yeah.
I'm on the board of course, two nonprofits, Blavity.org and another one called Leading Women Defined, which was started by the former CEO of BET, Deborah Lee.
Mm.
And I've learned we've only had one board meeting. I just joined the board this year, and we had a board meeting the other day. It was really interesting because it's a democracy in a lot of ways. There is no hierarchy, right? So
Mhm.
I was listening a lot, and I basically was thinking to myself, I was like, how are we going to approach decision making on a nonprofit when there's no hierarchy and there's no ownership? It's just a lot of just a lot of conversations. In
Mhm.
a for-profit company, there's a clear hierarchy,
Yep.
right? Either because you're the largest shareholder, or you have the title, or whatever it may be. So in a nonprofit world, it's also a lot of Robert's rules situations going on in the conversations because it is a bit of a democracy. It's
Mhm.
very interesting.
Not only that, there's a caveat to it too. Depending on the nonprofit's bylaws, there's an
Hmm.
executive committee that can trump all of the decision of the democracy.
That's right. So you're just kind of like just chit chatting. I'm like, are we making a decision here? Or are we just having a conversation?
Yeah.
Unclear.
So it's important for people to understand that, because it's important who you pick to be on your board in the beginning.
Right. And do you have to have a board?
You do. You need to have a board. And each state has different laws. Like California state, you have to have a minimum of 3 year president, secretary, and treasurer.
Hmm.
There's some wiggle room in some of that. Best practice is really to have your president, secretary, and treasurer, no matter what state you're in, and then to grow your board from there. That's just best practice. There's legality differences between all the different states, but I usually recommend 3 separate individuals, because some people want to be president and secretary. No, I don't allow it. Not with my clients. I don't allow it.
Yeah. For what, if you guys are curious, I'm the secretary of Blavity.org. Uh, not that it means that much. I'm
Such
very
a
not
cool role. It's such a cool role.
such a great role. So what's the difference between a 501c3 and having a fiscal sponsor?
Cool. Good question. So, if you're somebody that has a 501c3, you have your own legal entity business infrastructure. You have your own employer identification number. That's how you open your bank account. That's how you give people tax write offs. That's how you file your taxes. You have your own board. You have your own bank account. Everything about it is its own legal entity.
Hmm.
Now, the difference between that and a fiscal sponsor, let's say you just have an idea that you want to have a program for the community, but you don't want to file for a legal infrastructure, then you would have a fiscal sponsor, which means another nonprofit organization that has their 501c3 would be basically your financial manager. Now, there's tons of fiscal sponsors that do more than that. For example, our nonprofit, the Nonprofit Plug Foundation, our fiscal sponsorship service also provides program development and execution and other support, only because I have found that most people who want to do like community good don't typically have a business background. It's not
Hmm.
like they went to school and got a business degree. They're typically people who just literally want to do good for the community, and the education backgrounds range middle school up to doctorates and everything in between. And so, for people who don't really have that business acumen, which is an absolutely okay thing, I tell people that
Yeah.
all the time. It is okay if you don't have business acumen. Just be a nice person. But it's okay if you don't have business acumen. Fiscal sponsorship is the way to go for you, because otherwise, the stress of that learning curve, going from I just wanted to serve PB&J sandwiches on Skid Row to now I have to manage QuickBooks and P&Ls and balance sheets and compliance reporting, all that, like, it is, that can be overwhelming for folks, and people don't know that there's this other option in fiscal sponsorship out there, where then all of that stress and responsibility is then on me, which
That's
is the
right.
stuff that I thrive off. That I like, that's the
That's your
nerdy geeky
jam.
side of me. I'm like, ooh, you give me, I'll do all that stuff.
Right. And that's actually how we got to you because at the time we had an ED who was like, I want to do good, but like all this other compliance stuff, can we find someone else to do it? We were
Yeah.
all like, yeah, sure. Find a
Yeah.
consultant or a service that can do this part of it while you're working on program development. We had talked about in my own family if we wanted to start like a family foundation because my dad gives away a lot of money every year and just does things that are good, similar to me, where I'm like, I just do the things just because it's the right thing to do.
Exactly.
And whether that's giving to universities or programs, a lot of things behind the scenes, have donated hundreds of books to hospitals, just depends on the day, right? And we just do that. And there's a tax deduction, when you decide to report it. I don't think I've ever reported any of my donations because I just don't feel like I have the
I mean,
time.
sometimes there's no benefit to reporting it, honestly.
Yeah, true. Or I just am like, how do you quantify like the books that you donate
Yep.
to the hospital for the kids? Like, I don't know, just whatever. It's fine. So, what is the benefit of having like a family foundation? Because I have noticed a lot of my peer entrepreneurs, like Pinky Cole, for example, I know she has like
Mhm.
a Pinky Cole Foundation, and I'm like, oh, like should I be doing that? What's the benefit?
So the biggest benefit for folks doing that is there's like the innate sense to do good for the community. That one we don't have to even debate that one. The second one really is the tax write-off. What's interesting about that though is you can't just like donate 1 million to your foundation. I mean, you can, but not all of that is even tax deductible for yourself. There's certain percentages against your adjusted gross income, your AGI, and so I always tell folks your CPA is your best friend. And not just any CPA, a tax exempt specialist CPA, because I work with both for profit CPAs and nonprofit CPAs. They don't even know how to communicate.
Hmm.
So if you're considering doing a family foundation because you want to get a tax write off, that is absolutely an excellent route to go. And what a lot of entrepreneurs and folks with companies that they just have the excess cash that they want to write off, good way
Mm-hmm.
to go. You just have to know that it's not all of it that is tax deductible. It's percentages. And sometimes it may be like 60% of your adjusted gross income. And I'm sure there's tons of other qualifications too that a CPA can speak
Mm-hmm.
to. But the reason you would do a foundation, and here's the interesting thing about the word foundation, it's used very loosely now. Back in the day, foundation was like what you and I think of as a foundation, where it's like a family foundation or a wealthy individual that just funnels their money into the nonprofit to then do good from there.
Mm-hmm.
Now, people who just have like regular public charities who have programming use the word foundation. So
Hmm.
it's very confusing out there for the community. Every day I'm constantly doing filings for folks and they want the word foundation. People just don't use it the same anymore. But your typical family foundation, it's because there's usually like a process because you want to donate the excess funds that you have or the surplus of funds, or you just
Mm-hmm.
want to do good and you get that tax write off and then you kind of go from there. Now, there's a difference in the legal filing, though, for a private foundation and a public charity, and those are different. Although they're both 501c3 tax exempt nonprofit organizations, a private foundation typically has one ish source of funding,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a different type of tax filing. So you don't go back and forth between private foundation and not. And some people start as a public charity and they
Mm-hmm.
don't meet the test to be a public charity. And then they have to transition into private foundation, which is fine. But going from private foundation into charity is a little bit more challenging. But it's
Right.
all in the like tax filings.
No, but this is important because I think the vocabulary does feel very nuanced, to
Mhm.
someone. And it's like, am I saying, like, let's say, for example, I want to buy a bunch of Black art because I just believe that, like, more Black artists, like, this is one of the things I talk about with my family. I believe that, like, more Black artists need Black people to buy their art.
Mhm.
And then the question becomes, okay, what are you going to do with the art when you die, right? So, do we want to put it in a foundation that then we say, great, this is going to be gifted to, XYZ museums, or these, it's going to become art that then can be used for other things in the future? Or do we want to put it under a trust,
I was just going to say, yeah. Yeah.
right? And so, I mean, these are like very first world problems, but this is why you guys listen to this podcast. So don't come from me, because this is the point, right? It's like, okay, maybe I should put it in the trust and then it can be loaned out to the museum, et cetera, et cetera. But like, it's still an asset
Right. And
that can be
remember, when
leveraged.
you put it into a nonprofit, you lose ownership.
Exactly. And then you don't have the asset to leverage. So, like, let's say you buy this piece of art that all of a sudden becomes worth $1 million for some random reason. Now the foundation has this asset that it can leverage, which is
Right.
lovely, but
Which
future
happens
generations.
too. I mean, people do that, and that's a form of a donation, right? So, a lot of times when people die and in their wills and trusts and stuff, they have notes in there of how they want their assets distributed. And a lot of people do choose to have those hard assets go to nonprofits that are just like their favorite nonprofits. They'll have their life insurance or, their house because maybe Maybe at one point in life, they were homeless. They became super wealthy. They bought a bunch of properties. And when they die, it says in their will that they want these properties to go to a nonprofit that does transitional housing and, is working to end homelessness. That's a common thing that happens here and there. It
Hmm.
happens with art, it happens with money. You just want to, the caveat to this, right, though, is like, go talk to an attorney,
Yeah, I
go get
think
the
that's the
legal
key.
structure on that, because what you have to think about is the end goal, or the difference between a trust and a foundation, and where that asset should go is, what did you want your end goal to be? Did you want it to be family legacy? Because then
Mm.
you would not put it into the nonprofit. Did you want it to purely, like, you don't care, it doesn't need to go to the family, you don't care what happens? So it's like donating a kidney. When you donate a kidney and it goes to another human, it is 1000% out of your control. And however that person treats that kidney, that has nothing to do with you. And you literally, that is it. Goodbye, kidney. You just say, kidney, there you go, off you go. It's the same concept.
And I think a lot of people think that they can control it. And actually, I think that's like my biggest thing that I want people to hear is like, when you have a nonprofit, you are not the CEO of the nonprofit.
Yeah. And there's some cool things to think about with that. Like, maybe, especially in the state of California, I'll use that as an example because just like tax stuff here is crazy. Is, it might be more beneficial to start a nonprofit versus an LLC if you're in a place like California, because the amount of taxes you have to pay. And when you start a business in California, you have to pay the franchise tax board every year, whether you have negative in your bank account or positive, and whether you operate or not, you still have to pay all of that. And then you have to pay taxes on all of the revenues. So
Mhm.
maybe a nonprofit is a better route for you to go while you're learning business acumen and how to create programs and products that are a bit more beneficial. Now, products are more of a for-profit thing. You don't really see
Yeah.
nonprofits doing that unless it's like that intellectual property and curriculum. And,
Right.
there's people who create toys like medical devices and things like
Right.
that. I would still do that under a for-profit. But a nonprofit is a great route to go if you're creating a business with a cause and you're impacting the community, like maybe a child care center, an after school tutoring program.
Right.
Those are great, great nonprofits, because then you're learning the business structure and the acumen without being penalized on taxes and paying fees
Yeah.
when you don't have that startup money.
Right.
Nonprofits are great if you don't really have the start money. However, just because you start a nonprofit does not mean you're entitled to funding.
Yeah. So let's talk about funding. So, how do people approach finding funds for the nonprofit? So, let's go back to that example of I am a psychologist and I want to create a program that gives free therapy to homeless trans youth.
Yeah.
Like, so good. Love
So
that.
good. Yep.
Right. And I'm a therapist by day, right? But this is like my passion. How does one even begin to approach funding for that?
So you can do things like, I tell people all the time, like, Google is your best friend. I mean, everything is on Google, YouTube University. So if you can't afford to pay for like a consulting firm and a company or a coach, literally put into Google, I am a therapist. I want to provide free resources. Are there organizations out there with funding or grants that will give me money so that I can go provide free resources? Some of the first places I would start if I was in that exact position, I would go to NAMI. That's a massive nonprofit organization and they actually grant out funds. So lots of nonprofits grant out funds. And a
Hmm.
lot of nonprofits grant out funds as like what you and I would call seed funding, startup
Yes.
funds, even
Yes.
to individuals. But even better than that, donor cultivation.
Hmm.
Donor cultivation is the first place I would actually start after sort of that Google search, because number one, that funding is unrestricted. So you can do whatever you want with it. And I say do whatever you want with it with like a little asterisk on it. And so that could be used to pay your salary, to do
Hmm.
outreach, to maybe rent an office space. If you're a nonprofit and you're a psychologist doing this, you probably can go get free space just by being a nonprofit. Parks and recs, the libraries, buildings, you can create these partnerships because you're a nonprofit to get these free spaces to use, schools, colleges, all of that kind
Hmm.
of thing. So donor cultivation is going to be your best friend. Fancy way of saying asking your friends, family, and business partners for money. That is what donor cultivation means. And you don't just go to someone and say, "Hey, can I get, 5,000 bucks?" You say, "Morgan, I have got this new program. I want to provide free therapy to trans youth that are battling homelessness. You know, I've worked with 5 youth already. Here's what's
Mhm.
happened with those youth. $5,000 would cover me getting them into housing, clothes, and that kind of thing."
That's right.
So that's where people need to start, is with donor cultivation.
And I think that what people miss is exactly what you just said, which is your money directly goes to insert mission. And like when people come to me and they're like, "Hey, can I have $500?" and $500 pays for like somebody's meals for a month. I'm
Mm,
like, "Yeah, you can have it." Well, it's
mhm.
usually not a month. It's like
Yeah.
12 months. And I'm like, yes, immediately, yes,
Yeah. How
here.
can you not say no to that? Like, that's impactful. I love a tangible ask. I love a tangible ask.
Yes. When someone's like, "Here's this money and I'm thinking about this and we're just getting started and da 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 da," I'm just like, "No, I'm good. No, thank you." You can, no, thank you. But if it is very cause and effect, and I
Mhm.
trust that that person is going to do the right thing and it will be cause and effect, even
Yeah.
if they say, it's 90% of it goes to this and the 10% goes to us continuing to operate our business, I'm like,
Yeah.
sure, happy to give to that. I think that would be my biggest recommendation for people who are listening, who are like, how do I get people who have discretionary income to make a decision to give me a piece of that discretionary income? Make the benefit so tangible, and that storytelling of these are
Yep.
the people you're helping,
Yep.
and your $10 buys this backpack, or your $100, if you want to buy one backpack, is $10. If you want to buy 10 backpacks, it's $100. Like, show me the scale, and then tell me the story after the fact, because that's how you're going to get the recurring contribution, which I also think is really important when you have a nonprofit. Being able to have your own donors that commit to you, like they're your patrons, is a much more sustainable way to live. Because when you want to get something done, you don't have to try to merge how you want to get something done to benefit or to fit into the requirements of a program or a grant or some other thing that you've been applying for. A lot of times when you're seeking funding, and we've done this process for Blavity.org, where it's like, okay, if we're running a program that then helps X amount of people get jobs, or X amount of people reskill, or X amount of people do this, then we're going to be able to apply for this grant funding, right? I even just looked at one that was like teaching communities about AI and like how to use
Mhm.
AI and how to have skills in AI. And as I was literally going, it was like $1 million. This was from OpenAI and GitHub and a couple of other people that had kind of come together to do this program that they wanted to invest in. As I was filling it out, Dr. Sharon, I literally was like, cringe. I don't know that over 2 years, we're really going to want to do exactly
Right.
what this grant says.
Right.
Like, I don't even know that I agree with the premise of some of the things that are requirements to receive this grant. And I know now enough that if I say yes to these funds, that then I'm going to have to report out on a thing that I may not actually philosophically agree with. And so, I didn't actually submit for the grant,
Yeah.
but
But
I
that's
had that.
important, though. People need to hear you on that, because when you apply to a grant, you are applying to that funder's program, not your program. You're applying to that funder's program. And there's a lot of grants that are like a 3-year commitment grant, and you have to follow what you said. Now they'll let you, like, do some like budget modifications and things like that, but you're applying to their program.
Right. So if you start a nonprofit because you want the freedom to help the people the way you want to help them, then you're going to want to spend a lot of time and effort cultivating your donors and cultivating campaigns that you do on a regular basis, a quarterly campaign, an annual dinner, a gala, whatever your mechanism is to help create those funds. And then let's talk a little bit about unrestricted and restricted funds, because I think that's really important too. Can you just break that down a little bit more?
Yep. So, perfect example. Let's say that you have a funder that gives you $10,000 for diapers. That $10,000 is only for diapers. And when you report to them, you have to show receipts of $10,000 worth of diapers. That is restricted funding. That is the most restricted I could give you as an example.
Mhm.
Unrestricted would be there's a couple of grants that have come out that are like capacity building grants. Unrestricted grants are fantastic because those come in the form of the funder knows and is saying you can do whatever you want, asterisk, with these funds. So it has to be mission aligned. So a lot of times, like discretionary funds from political, like council districts, board of supervisors, those are fantastic funds. Actually, they're some of my favorite to go after. It may be a $25,000 grant for your nonprofit to, let's say, your mission is to end homelessness. Here's
Mhm.
$25,000 to end homelessness. So you might be able to use that to pay rent for people, to buy groceries, to pay a portion of your salary, all within the context of your mission.
Mhm.
Restricted. The grant will tell you exactly what it is for. Do not deviate from that. Unrestricted, asterisk, do whatever you want with it.
Right, including paying yourself.
Yeah.
A lot of nonprofit founders that I meet barely pay themselves because maybe even though they have funding, they actually don't have any funding to run the nonprofit.
Mm-hmm.
And that is
It
their
kills
biggest
them.
thing. That's their biggest thing. We don't take salaries on Blavity.org because we have day jobs. So we're like, I'm not taking this money out of here. Right.
Yep.
And I think that's given us a lot of freedom because we don't really have overhead. Like our overhead is the tools that we use,
Mm-hmm.
the tax compliance stuff, that's
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Yep.
Right. So any dollar that really comes in is going directly back out to the community. And I think that that has given us a lot of freedom. In fact, like even when we have had grants, we wind up underspending what we thought we were going to spend. And then we wind up with a surplus, then we're like, okay, well, what else can we do with this money? And who else can we help with this money? And it's a really interesting thing. The other thing that we've done, which I have to give a shout out to Aaron because I feel like a lot of people don't think about this is when you have those surplus funds and you don't have necessarily, you're not planning on spending it, investing it in a high yield
Mm-hmm.
savings account
Mm-hmm.
because we have literally made income in our nonprofit because of that. And then we use that as our overhead, like basically
Yep.
our baseline overhead, so that then we're literally every year, like, I mean, it's basically like having an endowment in some
Mm-hmm.
ways, right? The bigger that we get, the more that we have in the bank, the more we're able to get a return on it. And we're not doing like 10% return. I mean, we're not talking like crazy returns here. But for a nonprofit,
It's enough to
30
cover like a low level salary or coaching or or compliance,
yeah,
like the stuff that you can't avoid paying as a business, whether you're a nonprofit or for profit. You
right,
still have expenses. You have to pay accounting, bookkeeping,
right.
tax filing. You have to pay those.
Exactly. And that could cost you up to $15,000 to $25,000 a year. And so for
Mhm.
us, we've been able to figure out a way where it's like, cool, that is going to be the interest that we get off these. And like, I think for me, that's been so refreshing too, because it really means that in perpetuity, we're able to create an institution that lives, that gives back. And the other thing that I've been doing recently, like sometimes I get speaking engagements or people want to, like, if I want an advisory board, they might say, here's $10,000 to be on this advisory board. And also, we're going to do a $10,000 donation to a nonprofit of your choice. Well, I always
Mhm.
obviously pick my own nonprofit. And then it's kind of like a double win. I'm like, okay, cool. My labor is also benefiting this entity that then is giving back. And so that's the other reason why having a nonprofit has been nice for me because there's situations where I'm like, I really don't want to take this money from this person, or like, I'm happy to do the thing, but they want to give me $5,000. And I'm like, my speaker honorarium is way more than that. You got a zero on there,
Yep.
but I'll take it and say, cool, actually just give it to the nonprofit. And like, that makes everybody feel good. Right. And that would be my other suggestions for people who are entrepreneurs or who have like other sources of money or assets or things that are coming in where you're like, I don't really want to take this personally, but you can give it to a nonprofit or
Mhm.
you can have a friend, like that could be how you contribute to somebody else where you say, hey, all my speaking fees for this year are going to actually go to this nonprofit that I'm supporting in my local community. People can get behind that.
And sometimes with that, you'll get more. So sometimes may be like, oh my God, so you're not taking your speaker fee and it's going to go to a nonprofit? I'm going to double that.
Exactly. That's actually happened before too. We're like, oh, that's really nice. Great. What else can we do with Blavity.org? I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, thank you for asking, in
Yeah.
fact. These
Yeah.
are the things you can do.
Yeah.
So I think that for anyone who's listening to this, my intention always with the podcast is to inspire you, right? It's not to give you the A to Z. That's why we bring people like Dr. Sharon on the show, because she's going to give you the A to Z, right? But my hope is that you're able to think differently about how you spend your time, and that it's not necessarily that you have to, again, work harder, but it's that you can work smarter with how you are receiving funds, leveraging your own value, creating more value for other people, and doing so in a way that can benefit you in the long run, whether it's through social capital that you're building because you're now invited to these upper echelon dinners and private parties. And like some of the most exclusive rooms are rooms funded by nonprofits and foundations and family
Yeah.
foundations. And you can only get in if you're like, yeah, I'm going to spend $10,000 to buy this table, right? But if you have a nonprofit or foundation, and that's like part of the thing that's built into your wealth story, that's no big deal because it's also doing good.
And I think that's what you just said. I think a critical component to your wealth story and to financial literacy is leveraging the different types of entities for business out there for sustainability for your income, because that's one thing that kills me about nonprofit founders is they will break their back and not
Yeah.
feed their family and feed the community first, which how could you not love that person? I mean, I've been there. I do that
Mhm.
here and there too. You have to feed yourself and your family. Otherwise, the community will lose you
Mhm.
to whatever extreme that might be, death
Mhm.
or whatever. The community will lose you. So you have to create that wealth story and have financial literacy, which is maybe leveraging both a for profit and a nonprofit for whatever that end goal is or whatever it is you're trying to sell or trying to provide.
Absolutely. And I think valuing yourself as a nonprofit operator. The other thing that I'll share, there's a couple of nonprofit folks who've been in Blavity.org fellowship programs, or I've worked with it, coached them with WorkSmart. They have their like day to day income and their salary as the nonprofit executive director. And then they also are getting booked for speaking engagements, or they're getting booked for like brand deals with brands to highlight their work, or, they're on like these lists of with brands. And so they get up, $5,000 or $10,000 for that. And they put that as income for their nonprofit. And it irks me every time. I'm like, but that's not the same. If you are a person, you as a CEO or executive director, like that is separate income. Stop giving it to the company that you work for or the nonprofit that you work for. Stop it.
Mhm.
Maybe you can give them a fee. So, like for me, if I get booked to do a speaking engagement or something like that, and it's stemming from the Blavity ecosystem, like a client is doing a thing, I have Blavity take a fee, right? Because I don't want any, checks and balances systems. Like
Yeah.
I pay Blavity a fee. If it's some other brand that we don't even work with that wants me to do a post on LinkedIn about something, that is a Morgan DeBaun LLC situation,
Yeah.
right? And you can set up those kind of infrastructures within your own nonprofit as well, so that you can make sure that you have financial stability for the work that you're doing outside of your job description as an executive director.
Mhm.
Okay. You don't have to be so self sacrificing all the time. To Dr. Sharon's point, you have to
Yeah.
sustain
It's just
yourself.
not healthy. It's
It's
just
not
not
healthy.
healthy.
And it's not to the benefit of the people you're helping. Because
Mhm.
if you're burned out and you can't afford to invest in the housekeeper to help clean your house so you have more time to give back to the other people, like that doesn't help us. There's no
Mhm.
brownie points for that. There's no pat on the back for being an exhausted nonprofit founder.
And when you're a nonprofit founder, and let's say you're also the executive director, you can absolutely have a salary. It can even be, it's
Mhm.
in the bylaws. There are plenty of salaries in nonprofits that are comparable and at a level that can sustain you. You don't have to be a $25,000 per year salary as a nonprofit executive director. Plenty of nonprofit positions pay between 50,000 to 400,000. And
Ooh,
you know how I know? Cuz I'll go pull a 990 of every single nonprofit I work with and that I partner with, and I'm
Mhm.
nosy as hell and I want to know everyone's salary. But I also
Yes.
do that because I want to know comparable, I do comparable salary studies for
Mhm.
folks too. And it's okay. You just want to have like appropriate salaries, reasonable salaries, and there's tax guidelines and stuff and all of that. But you can have a very, very great salary. Nonprofits can be very lucrative. It's just not the same terms in for profit.
That's
But
right.
they can be very lucrative. And that's the other thing people really need to know is you can go into the nonprofit sector and still have a very comfortable life and take care of your family and
Yes.
take care of your community. It's like the coolest thing combo ever.
I agree 100%. And also, one thing Dr. Sharon said that I just want to make sure y'all heard, you can look up a lot of these things online because nonprofits have to report to the government. So you can look up the salaries, the overhead, how much money they're making from donors, how much money they're getting from grants. You can look that up. And I do it all the time because so many of Blavity and Afrotech's like different niche competitors are actually nonprofits. And I'm like, great. I wonder how much Grace Hopper is making. I wonder
Mm-hmm.
how much executive ELC is making, how much these people's salaries are. It's public information. They're
Yeah.
nonprofits.
Yeah.
That's all I'm gonna
So don't
say,
feel
y'all.
so bad when you're taking a salary because everyone has to take a salary. Everyone has mortgages and rents to pay
Listen, the
and
travel
food.
budgets I've seen,
Yeah.
the I sometimes I'm like, stop it. That is obnoxious.
Yeah.
Not all the two that I just said, they're all very
Yeah.
reasonable and financially responsible. But
Yeah.
some nonprofits, I'm like, wow, it's not that they're getting away with this. This is industry standard,
Yeah.
tipping on scale. So
Yeah.
that is all to say, do your own research, and you don't have to necessarily be in a deficit to be able to do good for people. And I think that is ultimately my point about not everything needs to be a nonprofit, but if you are going to do it, like you can do it in a way that you're still able to live a balanced life.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Dr. Sharon, how can people connect with you? How can they connect with the nonprofit Plug University? What else can they do?
Perfect. So best way to connect with us, thenonprofitplug.com, at the nonprofit plug on Instagram, at the nonprofit plug on Facebook, info at the nonprofitplug.com. I make it really easy for folks. So, and as long as you're seeing the nonprofit plug with the little elephant icon, that is definitely our firm. My last name is Elefant. So, I had to brand it with the most intelligent animal out there. The nonprofit plug, that is us. You can find out all about the nonprofit plug university on the website too, and especially from our social media. It's free to join. We post grants on there. It's a community of over 300 people and other nonprofit founders. It's a great way to just connect and, share relatable stories.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time today. And thanks for pouring into us every day. And thank you for your patience with me and my co-founders. We love you.
All the time.
All right, y'all. That's it for this episode. If you found this enjoyable, make sure you leave us a comment, a note. If you have questions for Dr. Sharon, feel free to write it in the comments. I'm sure she'll linger on both Instagram, LinkedIn, and TikTok. Also, my request is for you to pre-order my book. It is available on morgandebond.com. You all know I poured my heart and soul into this book to help you work smarter, not harder. It's called Rewrite Your Rules, and it gives you all the tools and tips that you need to be able to define for yourself how you can leverage your unique skill set, your values, your principles to live the life that you actually want to be living by your intentional design, not by societies, not by the other people who tell you what you should or shouldn't do, but by actually getting clear on that for yourself. And then it has tons of frameworks and, of course, all the stories of how I did or didn't follow my own rules in the book. So please make sure you're pre-ordering it, and I can't wait to hear from you soon. See you next week. Bye. Thanks for listening to the Journey Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you leave a review and head to our Instagram and YouTube to leave a comment. I look forward to hearing how this podcast has made an impact on your own journey.